Torrential rains pounded without end, swelling the Sierra River over its banks and turning it into a raging beast of mud and fury. As Ethan Cole drove his pickup along the surging waters, his loyal companion, a black Labrador named Midnight, suddenly leapt from the truck and plunged into the flood. In that horrifying instant, Ethan thought he had lost his only friend. But as his eyes searched the churning waves, he realized Midnight wasn't panicking. The faithful dog had seen what human eyes had missed. He was fighting the brutal current with every ounce of strength, carrying out a rescue mission Ethan could not yet comprehend. And then, in the very heart of the maelstrom, Ethan finally saw it, a tiny, helpless Bobcat Kitten, just seconds away from drowning. This is the story of a rescue that should have been impossible, and what happened afterward, in the humble wooden cabin Ethan called home, would become the most beautiful heartbreak of his 30 years in the forest. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss any of our unexpected stories. For more than 3 decades, the Sierra Nevada forest had been both the sanctuary and the office of Ranger Ethan Cole. He understood its every silent breath, the way the sunset slanted through the towering ponderosa pines, the faint rustle of leaves that meant a moose browsing rather than the shadow of a prowling wolf, and the sharp, clean scent of pine resin rising after a summer rain. Through all those years, he always had a 4-legged companion at his side, the loyal shadow of his life. The first was a yellow Labrador named Rusty, then a dark chocolate one called Bruno. And for the last 9 years, it had been Midnight, a black lab whose coat was as dark as a moonless night, and whose heart held a steadfast devotion like the northern star. Midnight was more than a dog. He was the furry, 4-legged extension of Ethan's own soul. He carried the unspoken thoughts, the quiet companion in Ethan's solitude. Their days passed in a familiar rhythm. Long patrols along the mountain slopes in an old moss-green pickup. The windows always rolled down so Midnight could stick his head out, ears flapping in the wind, his face lit with pure joy. They crossed miles of trails together, the footsteps of man and dog leaving a steady beat upon the forest floor of the Sierra Nevada. When evening came, they would sit on the wooden porch of Ethan Cole's small cabin, watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies, a shared silence that spoke louder than any conversation. Ethan, a man who had lost his wife more than 10 years ago, and whose grown children were scattered across the country, found in Midnight a quiet companionship that filled the vast emptiness of his life. But on that fateful morning, as spring had only just begun, the forest was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a veil of chaos. A late-season storm had swept in from the Pacific, a beast of wind and water that howled and battered the mountains for 3 relentless days. The sky was streaked with angry, bruised purple, torn open by rage. The rain no longer fell in droplets, but poured down in heavy, wind-driven sheets, slashing sideways in the gale. The creeks and streams, once gentle ribbons of clear water, had turned into roaring mud torrents, spilling over their banks, clawing at the earth with furious power. The river that wound through the valley, the lifeblood of the Sierra Nevada forest, had become a monstrous, raging force, untamed and out of control. All the while, Ethan Cole was still out on patrol, a task both necessary and perilous in the storm's wrath. He checked for fallen trees blocking the service roads, for signs of landslides, and for any careless campers who might have been caught in the deluge. Midnight sat silently beside Ethan Cole in the cab of the pickup, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by a tension that could not be hidden. He didn't whine, didn't fidget restlessly, but sat unnaturally still, his deep brown eyes locked on the world beyond the glass, where everything seemed to spin and churn, his whole body coiled like a compressed spring. The narrow road they traveled clung to the edge of the swollen river. What raged below was no longer a gentle current, but a nightmare of chaos. Brown froth exploding, rotten logs and debris surging in the torrent. Enormous trees, ripped from the earth, were tossed about in the flood waters, hurled like matchsticks in the storm's fury. The roar was deafening, a guttural, relentless thunder that seemed to rattle the very frame of the old truck. Ethan's hands clenched tight around the steering wheel, his knuckles bone white. He had seen floods before, but this was different. This was no ordinary high water. This was nature laid bare raw, savage, and merciless. And then it happened. Without a sound, without a bark or a whine, Midnight suddenly launched from his seat, a black blur slicing through the air. Before Ethan Cole could shout his name, the dog had leapt through the open passenger side window and vanished from sight. For one breathless instant, Ethan's world froze. He slammed the brakes, the pickup skidding across the slick mud before jerking to a violent stop. Only one horrifying thought hammered through his mind. Ethan panicked, certain that Midnight had slipped, had fallen, or worse, had been swept away by the flood. He scrambled out of the truck, his boots sinking deep into the sodden earth, shouting his dog's name into the screaming wind. But the gale shredded every syllable, ripping the sound from his lips. He scanned the raging river, his heart pounding a frantic, violent rhythm against his ribs. But all he saw was chaos, a violent churn of mud and water. A cold, sharp fear gripped Ethan Cole. In a moment of madness, he nearly hurled himself into the torrent, a desperate, blind impulse born of love for his dog. But then he saw him. Midnight was in the water, not swept away, but fighting. His powerful legs churned, his head held defiantly above the surface. He battled the current with a will and strength that were staggering to behold. But he wasn't swimming toward the shore. He was driving himself farther out, straight into the river's furious heart. Ethan's horror twisted into utter disbelief. "Midnight, come back! Listen to me," Ethan shouted, his voice raw and breaking against the howling rain. But the dog ignored him. Midnight's eyes were locked on a single point. Ethan followed that gaze, squinting through the lash of rain, and then he saw it. A tiny speck of tawny fur, flailing in the maelstrom, a helpless little creature, tossed mercilessly in the flood's fury. Too small, too fragile against the river's terrible wrath. So much so that Ethan thought his eyes deceived him. But no, it was a bobcat kitten, its body limp, its head barely breaking the surface before sinking again. It was being swallowed by the river. A wave of realization crashed over Ethan Cole, so powerful it stole his breath. Midnight had not panicked. He had seen what human eyes had missed. He had heard a cry for help no human ear could catch. He wasn't fleeing. He was on a mission, a rescue. Ethan watched, his heart lodged in his throat, as Midnight closed in on the tiny creature. The bobcat cub was nearly gone, its frail body limp, its feeble movements fading with each second in the freezing water. With an incredible gentleness, Midnight clamped his jaws around the cub's scruff firm, yet astonishingly careful. Then he turned, beginning the brutal, heroic fight back toward the shore. The river roared, resisting every inch of their progress. A massive whirlpool, black as a gaping maw, seized them both, dragging them down into its depths. Ethan could see the strain carved into the dog's body. His muscles bunched and quivered with effort. For one terrifying moment, Midnight's head slipped beneath the raging surface, then he broke through again, sputtering. But those iron jaws never let go of the fragile life caught between survival and death. Ethan Cole didn't hesitate. He plunged into the churning water, the icy current wrapping around his legs, trying to drag him under. Gritting his teeth, he braced himself against a half-submerged log and thrust his arm forward. "Come on, Midnight! This way!" he shouted, his voice hoarse like a desperate prayer. With one final, extraordinary burst of strength, Midnight cut through the raging current and reached the shallows. Ethan seized his collar, hauling with all his might, dragging both the dog and the bobcat cub onto the muddy bank. The three of them collapsed in a heap, soaked, trembling, gasping for air. At once, Midnight released the cub, licking it frantically, nudging the tiny, motionless body with his nose, as if trying to pour his own warmth and life into it. The small creature lay terrifyingly still. Its fur was plastered against its frail frame, its eyes closed tight. For one dreadful moment, Ethan believed they were too late. And then he saw it, a faint, shuddering flicker in its chest. A breath. "He's alive," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking with relief. A wave of release surged through him, so powerful it made Ethan Cole dizzy. He gently lifted the tiny creature, weighing no more than a bag of sugar, and wrapped it in the spare jacket from his pickup. Midnight, though utterly exhausted, let out soft whines, his anxious eyes never leaving the small bundle cradled in his master's arms. "Good boy, Midnight," Ethan murmured, his voice cracking with emotion as his trembling hand stroked the dog's soaked head. "You did so good." The drive to the veterinary center in the nearest town passed in a daze. Ethan held the shivering bobcat cub on his lap, the truck's heater blasting, fogging the windshield with warmth. On the passenger seat, Midnight sat hunched, water dripping onto the floor, his gaze shifting from the cub to Ethan, an unrelenting look of worry, as if to make sure both were safe. Dr. Samuel Thorne was a man who had seen just about everything in his 40 years as a mountain veterinarian. But even he raised an eyebrow when Ethan Cole walked in clothes dripping wet, a trembling black Labrador at his side, and in his arms, a half-dead bobcat cub. "Well, Ethan," Thorne said, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "You've never been one to do things halfway, have you?" At once, they rushed the cub into the examination room. It was severely hypothermic and had inhaled a dangerous amount of water. Its chances of survival, Thorne explained gravely, were slim. Yet as he worked administering warm fluids, fitting an oxygen mask, he couldn't help but marvel at the little creature's resilience. "He's a fighter, this one," he murmured. Meanwhile, Ethan checked over Midnight. Miraculously, the dog was nearly unharmed, save for a few minor scratches on his muzzle, likely from the cub's flailing claws in its panic. Midnight was exhausted, but his spirit never wavered. He sat motionless outside the exam room door, ears pricked high, eyes fixed on the closed entrance, straining to catch every faint sound from within. In the days that followed, the veterinary center became a second home for Ethan Cole and Midnight. The bobcat cub, whom Ethan had begun to call Lucky, clung to life by the thinnest of threads. He was weak and terrified, hissing and spitting whenever a human hand came near. But strangely, he never hissed at Midnight. With Dr. Thorne's permission, Ethan was allowed to bring Midnight into the recovery room. The big black Labrador would lie down just outside Lucky's kennel, his presence a calm, steady anchor in the cub's chaotic, unfamiliar world. He never tried to push closer, only lay there in silence, eyes unblinking, a quiet guardian watching over each fragile breath. Slowly, as if by a miracle, Lucky began to recover. His breathing steadied, his body temperature returned to normal, and he started to take the special milk formula from a small bottle. The turning point came on the 5th day. Ethan and Midnight were in the room, watching as Dr. Thorne patiently coaxed the cub to eat. As usual, Lucky huddled in the back of his kennel, a tiny bundle of fur, stubborn and wary. At that moment, Midnight let out a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't distress. It was a gentle growl, a sound of reassurance. Lucky's ears twitched. He peeked out from behind his tiny paws, his young blue eyes fixed on the big black Labrador. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. He crept toward the front of the kennel, his nose twitching. Midnight gave another soft, low whine, this time slowly lowering his head between his front paws, a gesture of gentle submission, utterly without threat. Lucky stared at him for a long time. Then, in a motion that blurred Ethan Cole's eyes with tears, the tiny bobcat stretched out a paw and touched the wire of the kennel as close to Midnight's wet nose as he could reach. From that moment, the bond between them was woven, and when Lucky was strong enough, Ethan brought him home to his wooden cabin in the Sierra Nevada forest. Ethan Cole had long experience rehabilitating wildlife. With Dr. Thorne's guidance, he built a spacious enclosure in his backyard, a semi-wild space with logs, rocks, and native plants that echoed the spirit of the Sierra Nevada. For the first few weeks, Lucky stayed in a large crate set beside Midnight's bed inside the cabin. The two creatures were almost never apart. Midnight, a dog who had never had a playmate of his own kind, seemed to take the tiny Bobcat as a younger brother. He was endlessly patient. When Lucky was small, he would often pounce on Midnight's thick tail, tangling himself in his own oversized paws. Midnight would simply wag his tail gently, as if indulging the childish game. And as Lucky grew, their play became livelier. They wrestled across the worn rug in the living room, a chaotic tangle of black fur and wild spotted markings. Lucky, sly and agile as only a feline hunter could be, would leap suddenly from behind the sofa. Midnight, with his natural good-natured heart, would always pretend to be surprised, letting the tiny attack claim victory. Midnight taught the little Bobcat things a dog should never have known how to teach. He taught him trust. Lucky, a fragile creature with every reason to fear the world, learned what it meant to feel safe. He curled up against Midnight's warm belly to sleep, his tiny body rising and falling with the dog's steady breaths. He groomed Midnight's face with his rough little tongue, and the dog returned the favor with gentle licks to the cub's head, a paternal tenderness both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. Ethan Cole knew this peaceful life could not last. Lucky belonged to the wild. The ultimate goal had always been to return him to the forest, where he truly belonged. As Lucky grew stronger and more confident, Ethan began the slow, patient process of preparing him for that return. He moved him into the outdoor enclosure behind the cabin. The separation was a heavy trial for them both. In those first nights, Midnight lay pressed against the ground just outside the fence, whining softly, his eyes never leaving Lucky. And Lucky, pacing the perimeter of the pen, let out the high chirping cries unique to bobcats, a plaintive call for his friend that carried into the dark. The rehabilitation methods Ethan Cole used were all designed to awaken the dormant wild instincts within Lucky. He hid food throughout the enclosure, forcing the young bobcat to rely on his keen sense of smell to find it. He fashioned a lure, a string with feathers tied to the end, and dragged it across the grass, teaching Lucky to stalk, to wait, and then to pounce, sharpening the skills that one day would be the key to survival. Through it all, Midnight was like a proud older brother, sitting just outside the fence, his tail tapping a steady rhythm against the ground. His eyes followed Lucky's every move, full of patience and encouragement. Each time Lucky made a precise leap or a graceful stalk, Midnight let out a soft bark, a simple sound, carrying the purest meaning of approval. It was as if he understood the importance of each lesson, as if he knew he was helping his little brother prepare for the harsh world beyond. And so time passed months, turning into seasons binding together the fates of all three, the man, the dog, and the bobcat, in a cycle that could not be stopped. Spring gave way to summer, and the lush greens of summer slowly faded, surrendering to the golds and deep reds of autumn. The tiny bobcat that had once hovered at the edge of death in the floodwaters had now become a magnificent, vibrant adult. Lucky's coat was thick and radiant, marked with exquisite spots. His muscles were lean and powerful. His eyes burned with intelligence and sharpness, the gaze of a true predator. He moved with silent, fluid grace, each step radiating confidence and readiness. He could stalk and capture the live mice Ethan Cole released into the enclosure, or climb the tallest logs with effortless agility. He was ready. Ethan knew the day had finally come. He had coordinated with the state wildlife department, and together, they had chosen a site deep within the Sierra Nevada National Forest remote land, rich with prey and almost untouched by human presence. The day of return to the wild began with a crisp, clear morning. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue without a single cloud. The air was filled with a bittersweet melancholy, a feeling that was part loss, part gift. Ethan lifted Lucky's transport crate into the back of the pickup. The bobcat, sensing something unfamiliar, grew restless. Ears pricked high, eyes fixed on the shift in his routine. Midnight seemed to understand as well. He no longer leapt into the truck with his usual eagerness. Instead, he sat motionless beside the door, head lowered, tail hanging still, quiet as the night itself. This farewell was one of the hardest moments Ethan Cole had ever faced. Before closing the crate, Ethan opened the door, giving Lucky one last chance to be with Midnight. The grown bobcat didn't run, didn't try to hide. He walked straight to his friend and pressed his cheek against Midnight's broad head, a gesture of pure feline affection. Lucky purred softly, a low rumble that carried through the crisp morning air, like a trembling farewell. Midnight answered by licking Lucky's head. His whole body quivered, burdened with sorrow he could not contain. He licked the bobcat's face, his ears, then his neck, as if trying to etch every detail into memory, as if bestowing one final blessing on his younger brother before he stepped into freedom. There were no barks, no whines, only a silence deep, heartbreaking between two creatures who had forged a bond that should never have been possible. At last, Ethan Cole gently lifted the grown bobcat and placed him back into the transport crate. The drive to the release site was the quietest journey he and Midnight had ever taken. When they arrived, Ethan carried the crate to a clearing on the mountainside, where the land opened to a sweeping view of the endless wild valley below. He knelt down and unlatched the door. Lucky hesitated for only a moment. His eyes turned to the boundless forest ahead, his true home. Then he looked back, his golden gaze meeting Ethan's and then Midnight's. That look carried understanding, gratitude, and a silent farewell. Lucky stepped out of the crate, stretching his strong, sleek body in the morning sun. And then, with one last fleeting glance at the dog who had once leapt into the flood to save him, he turned and vanished into the thick underbrush. A moment before, he had been there, a beautiful, vibrant creature. And the next, he was gone, swallowed by the green embrace of the wild. The silence that remained spread over everything. Midnight stood rigid, eyes fixed on the place where Lucky had disappeared, his whole body taut. Then he let out a mournful whine, a sound torn from the very depths of his soul. It was the sound of loss, of love, of a friendship that had dared to defy the laws of nature. Ethan Cole sank to his knees, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the thick black fur still warm with life. In that moment, he knew that both of them had lost a part of themselves, yet had also witnessed a rare miracle. A friendship between a man, a dog, and a bobcat. A bond that would live forever in memory, like a flame that could never be extinguished. "He's home now, Midnight," Ethan Cole whispered, his voice breaking. "He's back where he belongs, and we were with him until the very last moment." Midnight leaned into him, his cold, wet fur brushing against his master's arm. The two of them stayed there for a long time, silently watching the wild valley before them, their hearts aching with the beautiful, painful price of letting go. They had created a small miracle proof that compassion is a language that crosses every boundary of species, and that love can bloom in the most unexpected of places. The memory of the little bobcat named Lucky, and the extraordinary bond he had shared with a loyal black Labrador, would remain forever etched in the heart of the old ranger and in the silent soul of the Sierra Nevada forest.